Australian Wildlife Conservancy has a mission that is straightforward but ambitious: the effective conservation of all Australian animals and the habitats in which they live. And guiding us in that mission is our board of directors. And I'm pleased today to be speaking with Professor Martine Maron, who is one of our board directors, been a member of the board since late 2022. Martine is a professor of environmental management at the University of Queensland. She also serves as a member of the Biodiversity Council as a councillor. She chairs the IUCN's Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation thematic group and is a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. And her research group at UQ works on problems at the interface of environmental policy and ecology, particularly looking at bird conservation, deforestation, and biodiversity offsetting. Martine, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Great to see you.
Over the Christmas break, I know a lot of us turn to nature as a kind of restorative, and this year has been kind of relentless for those of us interested in conservation, not such a positive year for nature. What are the places in nature where you find solace?
Oh, that's such a great way to start. You're right. I think we're all feeling in need of a lot of restoration this year in particular. And I have to say, over the past few days in particular, I've been loving where I am right now. So I'm here on Yagara country, about an hour inland of Brisbane, almost in the Lockyer Valley, just on the edge of the Brisbane Valley for people who know it. And it has been, we've had a lot of rain, and it is greener and more alive here than I've probably ever seen it. We moved in here, it would have been 16 years ago, and it was pretty much a horse paddock, and we've sort of revegetated the place. So certainly looking at this restoration on this block is something that restores me, and just hearing the absolute cacophony of birds and insects and frogs that are going completely berserk at all times, and they're probably going to interrupt this discussion. The channel-bill cuckoos are just incredible at the moment. Their voices are so loud.
We welcome interruptions from cuckoos or other birds. What are some of the species there that are special to that area, to southeast Queensland? It's a real hotspot for wildlife, isn't it?
It is. It's an incredible place. I grew up in Melbourne, and in eastern Melbourne, in the suburbs, at a time really before a lot of people got into planting a lot of natives and things, and they've grown up now. And when I go back and visit my family, I see a lot more wildlife there than when I was growing up. It's a bit of a desert when I was growing up. So for me, I'm just excited to see, first of all, the things that in my mind, I think of them as really sort of tropical things like the channel-bill cuckoos, but we've even had rose-crowned fruit doves and black-faced monarchs and things turning up here, which is pretty exciting. And I mean, earlier this year, not that long ago, we had the first square-tailed kite flying over our place, which is just such a great bird to see. And I'm also really excited at the moment because we now at the moment have 3 species of fairy wrens all living on our block here at the same time, which is super exciting.
Great. And so special to have a patch like that where you've seen restoration work and seen wildlife return over that extended period of time. I think a lot of people in the audience will appreciate that sort of long-standing connection to a patch that's special to you.
And it's in like you say, in a year like this, to be able to walk outside and say, no, we can make a difference. You can see it right in front of you, and it's made a difference to, you know, so many dozens of species. And this is just a couple of hectares, you know, tiny little patch.
I know you've also spent a lot of time in southwestern Victoria and parts of South Australia. Is that another place that's special to you? And tell us a bit about the landscape there and the nature there.
Yeah, so like a lot of people at this time of the year, I get quite migratory visiting family. And my husband's property farm is in Western Victoria, and his family is in southeast South Australia, just over the border there. So I'll be heading down to spend some time there, and it's always nice. I don't get there as often anymore, but I actually started out my research career working in Western Victoria, studying the red-tailed black cockatoo, the southeastern one, which there's only about 1,500 birds left on the planet. It's a really, really threatened bird. And some of the habitats that bird relies on are on the farm. So the bull oak woodlands, which is the type of woodland that I worked on for my PhD. So, you know, places, habitat types that I'm really connected to. And I love to go back, walk through and see the birds that, you know, I've cared about so much for my whole life, the birds that live in these woodlands still hanging on there and doing well, especially in those places where we've got, you know, my husband's fenced off areas and protected it, allowed some more trees to come back, done a lot of replanting. So yeah, it's a great place to visit.
Wonderful. So a quite different landscape, it sounds like. And that interest in woodland birds, which I know has been an ongoing theme throughout your research career, things like red-tailed black cockatoos, which are hollow nesters. What are the research questions that you've tried to address over your career, looking specifically at woodland birds?
Yeah, woodland birds, I don't know what it is particularly that just attracted me to birds of woodlands. And it wasn't any one particular species. You know, I love them all. What I love about woodland birds is it's their collective way they run the ecosystem, you know, all the different jobs that a really healthy, diverse group of a species rich woodland bird assemblage performs together, you know, so all of the insectivory and the nectivory that's pollinating the different species, and the, you know, frugivory, not as much in the woodlands down south, but a bit more in the north, you know, the scavengers, just the sort of the richness and all the different roles that a whole bird assemblage performs. And what I'm interested in is, you know, anyone who works on birds, anyone who observes the birds around them has probably seen the really sad decline of those intact bird communities. Sure, we still see the common things, usually bigger bodied birds, but in a lot of parts of Eastern Australia and also Southwestern Australia especially, we're losing a lot of the smaller bodied birds that do a lot of those important jobs from the woodland. So the research that I'm interested in is, why is that happening? And what are the levers that we can pull to try to get those birds back in those landscapes doing the jobs that we need them to do?
Yeah, I think we've tried, especially over the last couple of years, to focus not just on species conservation. I'm talking about the AWC sort of communications, I guess, that we're not just intervening to stop a species go extinct, but also why that's important, about those roles that every species plays within a broader ecosystem, the interconnectedness of communities of species, as you're describing. And I understand more recently you're looking at a typology, a way of kind of classifying bird communities. What's the purpose of that? How will that help with conservation?
Yeah, well, this is something that's been on the boil for a while now, and is really driven by the fact that we are familiar with the idea of thinking about plant communities, and we know that some plant communities have been really degraded and cleared and are threatened with extinction. And so we can actually list a threatened ecological community under the EPBC Act. But when we have a look at those, they're mostly described based on the vegetation. But of course, as you know, those working with AWC, those following these webinars know extremely well, you can have what looks like a really intact vegetation community, and it's missing its fauna, and it's missing its function, and it's not actually healthy behind the plants. And I think that that's a syndrome, as I described, that many of us see starting to happen, in fact, very well advanced in some areas, with woodland bird communities. But because there wasn't a technical definition of, well, what is a bird community? What different types are there? How can we measure the health holistically of a bird community in like a really comparable way, so that we can assess it against, you know, the strict criteria for listing as a threatened ecological community? And so working with people like Hannah Fraser and a huge number of really awesome ornithologists from around Australia, we sort of put together a bit of a description and some initial metrics of condition. That was a few years ago. And since then, we've got some funding to expand that project so that we can actually assess all of the bird community types across Australia. But the very first step is to come up with, what is the typology? You know, what are the different types of assemblages that birds co-occur in? And that's a really fun project that we've been working on, hopefully, like a lot of scientists at this time of year, hoping to submit the paper before Christmas, looking less likely with every day that passes.
Good luck with that deadline. Yeah, and that's really interesting, because it's kind of, you know, that whole role of, I guess, taxonomy in biology is putting borders around things which are fuzzy, that they've got fuzzy edges, and especially with ecosystems or communities, there'll be lots of overlap. But by doing that, it allows us to manage, or to assess threats and manage appropriately for each context. It sounds like really important work and very interesting.
It's very fun to just get back into all the old literature around
Mm.
how people have tried to put bird communities into boxes over the years. Of course, they never really fit in boxes. You're right. Nature is a wonderful wild continuum, and that's how it should be. But when we're faced with, a system that requires classification, measurement, assessment against criteria, then we have to work with it as best we can. And so being able to understand, well, what are the different assemblages? It helps us understand, okay, well, what are the different threats that apply in different areas that affect different types of bird communities in different ways? And therefore, what do we need to do to try to conserve them better and more holistically, rather than only looking at it on a species by species basis? Because as you know, we are just, at the moment, we are just adding species one by one by one to the threatened species list, which is extremely depressing, very necessary if it's reflecting reality. But perhaps an efficient way of trying to tackle this is to look at this as an assemblage-wide problem and do something more holistic to conserve entire communities.
That sounds like a really sensible direction. And I guess that brings us sort of into the area of your research, which has looked at conservation policy. And I know that's a particular interest. I know in the invite to this webinar, I said we'd be talking about, the bright spots of hopefulness and where we find hope. But I think when it comes to conservation policy, there's probably more to say about what's not working rather than what is. Can you give us, in as short a time as you can manage, a summary of what's not working? What are we getting wrong about conservation policy in Australia?
Oh, goodness, in a short time. I mean, yes, I giggled a bit when I saw the description, and anybody who knows me probably also giggled a bit at the idea that I was going to be really super positive, because, yeah, half of my work does involve working on the problems, and they are large. And it is important to remember that, we are facing a really enormous uphill battle. We are still a land clearing hotspot in Australia, a wealthy, smart nation like us, still clearing old growth habitat, for all sorts of reasons. And we are enormously underfunding, as we all know, the conservation effort that is needed. We have such an enormous responsibility in Australia. Most of our fauna are endemic. It's just our responsibility to look after them, and we're failing. And nobody disagrees with that assessment. But, governments aren't stepping up to the plate with answers. They just aren't. There's lip service, but there's not a lot of dollars, and there's not a lot of action on policy that would actually change the fact that at the moment we're losing vastly more habitat than we're putting back. And I mean, I think it's really positive that, the federal government, for example, in the new National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which has to be submitted under the Convention on Biological Diversity that we're committed to, it says that we, as a nation, we will halt and reverse biodiversity decline by 2030. Well, 5 years, the time's ticking. We're just not seeing the action to really achieve that outcome yet.
Yeah, it is depressing. It can be depressing. I think, one of the reasons that I feel hopeful is, I guess, being involved with AWC and seeing projects that are working, that are turning things around on our sanctuaries and our partnership sites. Do you think that, as an NGO, organisations like AWC are able to be sort of more ambitious in some ways? But, should the onus be on NGOs for this, collective responsibility of looking after our natural heritage, our biodiversity?
I mean, my personal view is it shouldn't be, but it is at the moment, more than ever, perhaps, it feels. And so I think the role of non-government organisations has probably never been so important. And I really mean right across the whole sphere of different, civil society actors, because we absolutely must be spending more than the pitiful crumbs that we send towards biodiversity conservation, more public money. It is not a big deal. We are spending over $20 billion a year in subsidies that harm biodiversity. Surely we can stump up a couple of billion to actually protect the foundation of life on this continent. That said, we need voices that are calling for that, but we can't wait for that, and we can't bet on that. We have to be doing the work on the ground to try to preserve what we can and reverse declines wherever we can before we lose things forever, which is why, you know, I get a lot of my hopefulness, what little there is left, it actually comes from working with organisations like AWC, because you do get to see those real positive outcomes on ground. And I must say, thank you probably on behalf of the students that I teach, because I teach conservation policy, and I can tell you by the end of semester, these guys are so depressed. But always the last lecture, I talk about AWC's work, and I can tell you it cheers them up as much as it does me.
That's so great to hear. One other thing that just struck me is that the problems we're facing when it comes to conserving biodiversity, mostly, at least my take on it, is they're not insurmountable problems. You know, we've got now a working understanding of what's required for ecosystems to be restored. We by and large understand what the major threats are. Some of those are really big and challenging. Others are sort of practical problems where we've got the tools that we are able to go in and address them, sometimes on a large scale. So it really is just the political will. That's the missing piece.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's demonstrated when you actually look at what AWC can achieve. You mentioned ambition before. And I mean, that's something that I feel a lot of sort of government interventions get really sort of almost just bound up and stunted by the difficulties, the permitting, you know, too many decision makers. I don't know. It's really refreshing to see some really big, bold things out there happening and changing things on the ground. So, yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about your interactions with AWC. When was the first time that you came across the organisation?
Well, oh gosh, I would have obviously been aware of them even before this, but when I was first sort of started to be aware of what was going on the ground was actually in 2008, because that's when I started my position here at the University of Queensland. And one of the first things I got to do was tag along really on a research trip that a few of my colleagues were doing up at Mornington, which, how amazing is that? It was only for about a week, but we were doing some ground truthing of some sort of quick bird satellite imagery, really. So we were out slogging in the heat and measuring vegetation and so on. But then in the downtime, we got to visit all the beautiful places and we got to see the incredible birds. It really is a breathtaking place. I'm sure there's lots of people watching who know exactly what I'm saying, but it is stunning. Got to see things like purple crowned fairy wrens, Gordian finches, just incredible. So that was my first connection to AWC.
And Mornington was, you know, such a hub and continues to be a hub for AWC's research in Northern Australia. But back in 2008, it was really becoming the template for what we would roll out across other sanctuaries in tropical savanna. Working under Sarah Legg at that time, there was lots of research into how fire management, the responses of wildlife to fire management, to removing feral, you know, large feral grazing animals, cattle and horses and donkeys. A lot of that sort of foundational research was happening up there in that sort of decade. Do you remember the sort of the science program or some of the projects that were underway up there?
Yeah, I was really struck by that. It wasn't why I was visiting, but it actually ended up redirecting my own research for some years after that, meeting Sarah and people like Kim Motte and people who were working on this really cool way of getting at the mechanisms and the timing when things were most stressful for savanna birds. So they were working on Gordian finches and comparing their stress responses, the body condition of the birds, with non-declining species to try to work out, well, when is the crunch time and in what sorts of landscapes. So they're looking at different fire regimes. So finding that really severe, and you're going to have to correct me, Joe, because I'm not going to remember all the details, but really, you know, hot, severe, frequent burns were the things that were causing this sort of peak of stress that was affecting the Gordian finch populations. And I just thought that using indicators of chronic stress was such a useful way of getting an insight into a population without having to wait for it to just disappear to know that something was wrong. And so I know that then informed a lot of the management, right, across a lot of those reserves, but also informed my own research in other areas. So, yeah.
And then, you know, the awesome thing is now you can go back to Mornington and see trees full of Gordian finches, incredibly special birds, which were on the decline. And it seems like that has now turned around thanks to the sort of interventions that were being established at that time. So, yeah, I can understand how that made a lasting impression. It did on me too, from being up there around the same time. Since joining AWC's board 2 years ago, you've been able to visit a couple more AWC sanctuaries. Can you tell me about your time at Newhaven in Central Australia? I think it was last year. What struck you about that sanctuary?
Goodness, being able to visit Newhaven, what a dream that was. What an incredibly stunning landscape. I remember back when it was first purchased by BirdLife Australia, or Birds Australia as it was then. I've had a long association with BirdLife, and I was really captivated by the images. It would have been the late 90s, I suppose, that we were seeing of this incredible property, and I heard about for 20, 30, whatever it is, years. Finally getting to see it, but to see it having come along to be a place where you can get up in the morning and you can go and look at the sand tracks and you can see these signs of activity. So the sort of thing that I was talking about before, the function of ecosystems, all the little critters doing the things the critters are meant to do in the ecosystem, is something that I think about a lot in the context of bird community decline. But of course, the mammal community decline thing is the classic story in Australia. And to be inside the predator-free area and actually see the signs that all these things were going on in the night that should have been going on, the burrowing, the turning over the soil, the predation, the granivory, that was one of the things that really struck me. Also seeing grey falcons, that was really quite a highlight.
We always remember our first grey falcon. Mine was at Newhaven too. And that project, I'm sure lots of the listeners today will be familiar with it. But yeah, Newhaven, we've now had 8 mammal species released there, all of which were regionally extinct in that part of Central Australia. Just this year, we released brush-tail possums inside that safe haven area, 9,500 hectares. And we've had some really interesting data coming from those possums. Some of them had radio trackers on, and you can see them moving around, sort of exploring the safe haven. A couple of have actually jumped out and had to be brought back in again. But watching animals as they adapt to a new environment, these ones mostly came from South Australia. It's fascinating, and that's a species that I think I've said before we take for granted because they're brush-tailed possums that we get in Sydney, in southeast Queensland, and probably where everyone else lives on this call. And yet, like so many small and medium-sized mammals, they're missing from a vast tract of their former range. So there's now this patch of landscape in Central Australia full of animals, like you say, performing those roles, those functions as part of that ecosystem. So it's a really great project. We've talked a lot about it previously, but I love Newhaven, and I think your visit there was timed as the reintroductions were reaching a stage of maturity where we've got populations really establishing throughout the fenced area. Very exciting. Next door to Newhaven, we've also got a partnership with traditional owners of Nalaju, and that's the landscape around there dominated by a large mountain, Central Mount Wedge. And that's a sort of evolution of the work we've been doing at Newhaven, with a lot more collaboration with traditional owners there. And I think you had the chance to visit Nalaju while you were out there too. Do you remember that time?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was just absolutely a really impactful visit for me. And I felt like it was just an example of a collaboration that is going to be enduring, because you can see how well everyone's working together. The right people are leading the right works. There was this amazing project, maybe you can talk about it, where the traditional owners of Nalaju were mapping out exactly what the important parts of the landscape were, not just from a biodiversity perspective, from a cultural perspective. It was an incredible piece of art, but also a piece of science, and just seeing the closeness of the collaboration and two-way knowledge sharing it really struck me. And I think these are the sorts of models that we really need to see a lot more of.
Yeah, that project I think was facilitated by Kim Mahood, who's an artist and map maker, and involved representatives from lots of communities who are traditional owners for the land, where Nalaju is, where this partnership has been established. Mapping onto this huge canvas sites where culturally important species were found, and that includes, food plants, species that are important food sources, so animals as well, and then also threatened species and things that, as scientists, we're interested in monitoring. It really is a different way of looking at the country, and that project, sort of all came together around that map, and it's now used as a planning tool, something that we can take out into the field, into communities to collaborate and design surveys, burning work, So it's a living document that guides that project. Finally, I think you've also had a chance to visit our sanctuary in the southwest where it all started, Karakamaya. So it was over 30 years ago that Karakamaya became the first AWC sanctuary. What did you notice about your time in the, I think it's Jarrah and Karri forests at Karakamaya?
Yeah, and of course the story from, I mean, we got to go spotlighting, and I got to see the quenda and all sorts of little things at night. But being a birdo, the way the forest was so alive with that bird community that I was talking about, and I'm not as familiar with the Southwest Woodland bird community, but geez, this one was just absolutely jumping with all those small birds, the whole spectrum of things, the pouncing robins and the tree creepers and all the little tiny foliage gleaning insectivores, everything that should be there was there, as well as the spectacular big parrots and everything. It was just a really great example of something that seemed really, really healthy, you know, surrounded by a lot of areas not so healthy. So yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Bringing us back to woodland birds. So that's sort of, you know, where we started. Thank you so much for sharing those experiences, Martine. And thank you for your guidance as a director on AWC's board. We're very lucky to have someone of your expertise and wisdom guiding our organisation. So thank you so much. And thanks for the conversation today.
It's a real honor to be part of an organization that seems to achieve so much, you know, so much impact per dollar per person. And I just want to say, like, to anyone listening, Christmas is a great time to talk about wildlife with family. Great way to avoid talking about politics at the dinner table. So it's a great way to share some of the cool stuff that AWC is doing, and also just an awareness of the amazing wildlife that we have in this country. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it, Joey.